Today we're going to be making homemade butter tarts for Christmas. I like to make the miniature ones as opposed to the full size ones because full size ones make more of a mess and it's just nice to have the flavor in your mouth, not to gorge on them. So what I do to make my dough is I measure out 3 cups of flour, and again this is all-purpose flour pre-sifted. So you put 3 cups into the bowl. Now this is the interesting part, is you want to take a 1/4 cup of the flour back out of the bowl and put it into a small one and set it aside. So now you've got 2 3/4 cup of flour in the bowl. And now we're going to use a full 1 1/4 cup of Crisco. These ones are interesting because they come in a full cup, and as you can see, so I empty one of these right into the container. Interestingly enough, Crisco used to add tops for these when you don't use the whole one, but for some reason they stopped doing it. So now you have to kind of package it yourself. So that's 1 whole cup. And then I'm going to open another one because I still need a 1/4 cup. Now depending on the altitude of where you're living, I live a little bit up in the mountains, a higher altitude, so I have to add the extra 1/4 cup of Crisco to it. People that are living like in Chicago and New York, you would only really need the 1 cup. So the higher the altitude, the more you're going to require. So I'm going to cut this at 1/4 cup right there. Replace that back. And then just empty it in there. What I do is also I add about a teaspoon worth of salt, which is about that much. I never measure it because that's usually about a teaspoon of salt. Using a pastry blender, you want to blend all the Crisco in to the flour, and you just keep blending it until it starts looking almost like peas. And if it starts getting caked up on your pastry blender, you can just use a knife like this, scoop it around the outside, and then just scrape the knife off in the inside, and then just continue on. Usually it'll get caked in the very beginning when you're starting it. Once you get going, it starts falling off itself. Now you can see the chunks are starting, right? We want to get those broken down just a little bit more. And you just a little twisting action in it. Push down and twist. If you don't have a pastry blender, you can use like 2 large forks to do this, or you can use knives and crisscross into the Crisco and the flour. Okay, so as you can see, it's got a few large chunks in there, but for the most part it's blended. So again, we're going to scrape off any excess off of your pastry blender. I like to use a knife because it gets right into the blades of the blender. Okay, now with the remaining flour, you're going to add 8 tablespoons of cold water. And using a spoon, blend it You want to try and blend as much flour into it as you can. So if you need to use the back of the spoon to push it up against the sides, that'll even it out a little bit. It doesn't have to be perfectly smooth. Just make sure all the flour is blended in there. Okay, now we're going to dump this into this. See, a little bit cake there. Dump it in there. And this is the fun part. I used to always stick my hand in there and blend it as it was. Now I've learned blend it with the spoon a little bit first because it really sticks to your hands. So once you see it starting to blend, you can start putting your hand into it. So we're just going to scoop that off. And now we're going to start blending. And as you can see, it's going to stick to you. You don't want a hard dough and you don't want a super soft dough. Hard doughs will crack as you're rolling them out. Soft doughs will stick to everything. I'll use two hands, get a little faster. So as you can see, it comes away from the sides when you're doing it. So make sure it's all thoroughly blended. Okay, so there's your pastry dough. So now you're going to take a little bit of flour and you're going to sprinkle it on the table. Take a little bit of flour in your hand. Make sure your roller is coated in flour so your roller won't stick to it. Take about a handful, a good size handful, and just make sure it's really pushed together. Now I usually pat it down with the side of my hand and I twist, trying to stop any cracking from happening. Okay, lift it up, make sure your flour is even again, coat just the top of it with a little bit of flour, and then start rolling it out. You want it about 1/8 of an inch thick. And lift it again, make sure you're got enough flour to keep it from sticking to the counter. Now what I use to make these shells is, because I'm making minis, I use a cup that's about 3 inches in diameter. And I put it down and I drop the cup because my hands are full of flour, and then I just cut out the rounds. Generally it won't stick to the cup, but if it does, just give it a good shake and it'll fall out. Okay, and this is the size that I'm using. I've got flour all over it at this point. What you do is you take your little tart shells, gently push them in to the pans. You can do decoration. You can use a fork and make a little decoration around. I just leave them natural. And you just do this to every one of your tart pans. As you can see, as long as you keep very floured tabletop, you won't have any sticking. You also do not need to grease the pans because there is Crisco in the dough, which adds its own how do you say, a little bit of a grease to it so that it won't stick to the pans.